Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome. Welcome to this introductory conversation on a series on the future of capitalism. My guess is when you were thinking about going to business school, you were looking at three things: ideas, talent, and network. The whole experience at CBS is centered on all three of those, and they all three come together under the auspices of the hub. The hub is an idea that brings together faculty, practitioners, you, to think about big questions that are going to move the needle in business and public policy. Round one of the issues in the hub center on business and society, a theme that goes throughout a lot of the MBA program. One of the hubs, I guess you'd call it a hublet or part of a hub, is on the future of capitalism. And that's what this conversation is about today. It's quite interesting because I tend to start from a question like this from the perspective of the Monty Python movie, Life of Brian. And in the Life of Brian, there's that great scene where somebody says, "What did the Romans ever do for us?" And then there's a list of 100 things the Romans did, and you realize, oh yeah, whenever there are comments about the future of capitalism or issues of capitalism, the Roman scene in Life of Brian kind of comes to mind. Now, this is going to be a conversation with Joe Stiglitz. I'm going to be asking Joe some questions and leave time for you two as well. I am so proud to say that Joe is a colleague at Columbia Business School. We've been friends for decades. I won't say how many, because that would date both of us. Joe is, of course, a Nobel laureate in economics for incredibly important work in asymmetric information. I began my career as a grad student with dog-eared copies of Atkinson and Stiglitz on my desk. Joe has been influential in public policy circles in Washington and around the world, and has been someone very prescient on the very topic of today. Now, Joe, just to start, to have a conversation on the future of capitalism in a business school, on one hand seems kind of odd, right? Because, this is supposed to be a citadel of capitalism. And indeed, economists going all the way back to Smith, thinking about classical economists through Marx to Schumpeter to modern neoliberal thinkers, all recognized, even Marx, capitalism as a very successful wealth-generating machine. And I think it's probably fair to say that most concerns about capitalism today are less about capitalism versus some other ism and more about distribution. And distribution of both opportunities ex ante and rewards ex post. I want to get a sense, do you agree with that? And yes or no, what steps do we need to take to get to a better capitalism in your view?
Okay, so first, is the microphone working? Okay, so first, it's more than just distribution is the problem. We live in a world of climate change, and there are problems of regulation, of making sure that businesses don't pollute. Right now, yesterday, the Supreme Court heard a set of big tech issues about social media and social harms, and how do you regulate those social harms?
Learned they didn't know very much about it. Just reading the transcript.
Yeah. It was really quite an amazing question, but the discussion they had. But the point is, and something that Adam Smith actually talked a lot about, is that some of the limits of capitalism is that you need to have a regulation. And just for instance, one of the things that even Adam Smith talked about was the tendency of businesses to get together to collude. Seldom do businessmen get together, but for
classic line in the Wealth of Nations,
right?
Yeah.
For to collude to raise prices. So even you might say in Europe, particularly liberal social democrats, liberal policymakers believe very strongly in antitrust policy, in competition policy. So for capitalism to work, there have to be certain rules, and including those rules for competition, rules to make sure you don't exploit in one way or another, including exploiting the environment. So that's one important set of restraints on capitalism. You might. The second point, just to amplify on your earlier remark, is in a complex world, a big world, you have to have decentralization. So you're going to have enterprises of, smaller units. And an important part of that smaller unit are going to be firms, businesses, and they're going to be a good way of operating is for them to basically maximize profits, but within a regulatory framework and within social norms that go beyond just maximizing profits. And that goes to this notion of stakeholder capitalism that's being discussed a lot. And one component of that is distribution. And I think of this as in two different ways. One of them is, what should be the legal framework and the norms. Milton Friedman, a little over 50 years ago, wrote a very influential article. He published it in the New York Times because I think it could not have been published in a respectable academic journal. But he argued very influentially that firms should just maximize.
Yeah, I'm definitely coming back to that for sure.
Shareholder value. Yeah. And that got incorporated into the legal norms, into corporate governance laws in many states. And that's sort of the mandate of corporations. But more recently...
Just pull at a couple things you've said so far. I certainly agree with you that when people say the word capitalism, nobody has in mind, at least today, a sort of strict laissez-faire, the government's nowhere to be seen, or even a night watchman state. Much more, Smith himself, as you pointed out, believed in public goods, believed in policing competition and things like that. So I think that would probably be table stakes for the word capitalism. But you mentioned climate change, and I wonder when you think about big externalities, just climate change is an important current example, is that a problem of capitalism or is it a problem of public policy? Because we know how to fix externalities.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, basically the framework is that should be largely a question of public policy, that we should have a carbon price, regulations, public investment to deal with climate change. But let's say you're a firm and the government hasn't yet adopted regulations to stop your polluting. Should you go ahead and take advantage of that gap and go ahead and maximize your pollution if it increases shareholder value? That's the question I'm raising.
I see.
And I think that responsible firms have to somehow balance the two and say, well, it isn't right for us to maximize our pollution just because the government hasn't yet come around to adopting the environmental regulations that we ought to have.
Okay, but let me ask you more about distribution. So suppose capitalism is a phenomenal wealth-creating machine, but the distribution is quite skewed. What should we be doing about that while not throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
Yeah, so it goes a little bit to the same issue. I was, I've gone to Davos in most years over the last almost 30 years, and every year we have discussions at dinners over responsible capitalism. And climate change has been one theme that's going on almost every year. But another theme is this distribution issue. And about and you have some very, very prominent capitalists talking about how capitalism isn't really dealing well with the problem of distribution. And about 3 years ago, the head of one of the corporations, a very well-known corporation, said he discovered that 40% of his workers were not getting livable wage. And, we've been talking about this with this very guy for several years. And the fact that he had just discovered that he was paying 40% of his workers at these very low wages, to me was quite striking. But the second thing was, once he discovered it, he raised all his workers' wages to a livable wage. Now, obviously, that may have hurt shareholder value. And it's that kind of question that we're talking about. You can do more. There is a trade-off, clearly. More in the short run than in the long run. I don't know if you saw the recent paper that came out talking about what is the major effect of the fact that more corporations now have MBAs as CEOs. I don't know if you saw this paper.
The one by Duran Asamoah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I know you may have a view on that paper, but
I do.
Anyway, what it showed was that after a company got a CEO with an MBA, shareholder value went up. Employment did not increase. Productivity wasn't really changed. And the main way that shareholder value went up was that wages and the share of labor went down. That the picture that he depicted was the way that we train you to be better business leaders was how to screw workers better. And that was the main, the thrust of this econometric done in a very systematic way was that it was realizing that you could push down wages. Interestingly, quit rates go up. And so in the long run, the firm may face a poor quality labor force, it may face higher turnover, lower morale, but in the short run, shareholder value goes up. That's the thing I think that is the negative side of focusing too much on shareholder value with a real effect on distribution.
In recent decades, when people talked about shifts in capitalism, they have in mind two big forces, and you focused on both of them. One in particular, first and foremost, technological advance, and secondarily, globalization. And you were very early in our profession of realizing that while these two forces are fantastic for the economy on average, they have severe disruptive consequences for many individuals and communities. How did you come to that view? Because you expressed it in your tours of duty in Washington, even in the 1990s. And what do you think about it today?
Well, part of the reason why I was very aware of it, I grew up in Gary, Indiana, which was a city, an industrial city, a steel making town that was being affected very strongly. And this is where the standard economic models that were prevalent when I was in graduate school and still prevalent, which assumed that there were costless transition from one sector to another. If one sector goes down, you redeploy those resources costlessly to another sector, to another location. That's not true.
Or even worse, economists sometimes refer to those as just transition costs.
Yeah.
Those actual human beings.
And you just, so it was just assumed that if a job was lost, the guy moves costlessly to a better job, his wages go up, and everybody's happy. And if you live in any of these places where that transition is going through, they're not happy. There's a lot of anxiety, and that affects productivity, actually, and it has enormous effects on obviously their families, their communities. So this assumption of you might say neoclassical economics was clearly wrong, and the consequences of that can be very severe. The second thing, going back to when I was in the Clinton administration, we had debates about trade liberalization. NAFTA was adopted during this period, even though it had been Bush's. The basic treaty, basic agreement was done under or drafted under Bush, and we also finalized the WTO agreement that began in '95. And the standard theory in economics, the standard model, said that free trade or even trade liberalization would have the effect of lowering the wages of workers in the advanced countries, and particularly of unskilled workers. This is called the Samuelson-Stolper theorem and the Samuelson factor price equalization theorem. So that was basic economics, and the intuition was very simple, even though the proof, it was not that, his proof was not that simple, but the basic intuition that if you are trading with a country with comparative advantage in unskilled labor or in labor, it would drive down your wages. Seemed pretty intuitive. And yet, in the discussion that we had in the White House, the assumption was that everybody would be made better off. And I kept raising this issue. How do you reconcile this basic theorem with what you're saying? And it was interesting. No one wanted to talk about the theorem. Of course, most people didn't know the theorem. They were lawyers. But even when you explain
the theorem... Bob Rubin did not know the theorem?
No, he did not know the theorem, and nor did President Clinton. Clinton had a better intuition about what was going on, but even among the economists in Treasury, you couldn't get a good discussion about what was wrong with the theorem, what are we going to do? We said we needed trade adjustment assistance to help those that were being dislocated. But when the bills were passed, trade adjustment assistance was cut out, and they said, well, let's still go ahead with it. And there was a vague idea of what what is called today trickle-down economics, that somehow if you make the country richer, everybody will be better off, even though there was no evidence or theoretical presumption over that. So I guess what I'm trying to articulate is that there was really a disjunction between what economic theory said would happen and what the people who were gung-ho over these.
Well, let me push you on that a little bit, because while the Stolper-Samuelson theorem may be hard, Econ 101 has an even simpler lesson that nobody believes that technological advance or globalization are Pareto improving. We believe that gainers can compensate the losers. And so if that's the idea, then what kind of compensation would you suggest? How do we help the Gary Indianas or the people who are left behind, rather than saying no to the trade agreement?
Well, I mean, that was the idea of trade adjustment, trade adjustment.
The trade adjustment assistance was never very effective.
No, it was never very effective, but that was, so the idea, so one idea was, but we still wanted to latch on to the idea that we could help them move to jobs. I think we didn't want to say, we'll put them on welfare. or will, for instance, give them an earned income tax credit. That would be another idea. But the idea that they would have to get permanent assistance in some way was something that people just did not want to buy into. They wanted to believe that somehow you could move them from one job to another job where they would be equally productive and therefore get just as good a wage, or even better, because the whole idea was that globalization was going to lead to the country to be more productive, and we would create more productive jobs. And the same thing in technological change. The ideology is that we created more jobs, more good jobs, when we have technical change. And so somehow, and this is where the mystical, that we moved people from the old jobs to the new jobs, and that would happen if we just gave them that dose of training. And as Glenn just said, the evidence on that ability to move the people was not there. Those trade adjustment assistance never proved that effective in the United States. It did prove effective in Sweden and some other countries. And an important question that we talked about was, why was it more effective there than in the United States? And one of the reasons was that they did develop training programs that were addressed, tailored to the new jobs that were being created. And we weren't doing that very well. We were creating training programs, but they weren't tailored to the new jobs that were being created. And maybe partly because we're a bigger country, and the new jobs were created in, Seattle, and the old jobs were in Gary, Indiana, and it's a big distance to go. So it may be the geography made those programs more difficult in the United States.
I want to ask you about the hold that neoliberal ideas have had on economists, but also importantly on their work in public policy. Going all the way back to classical liberals like Smith and The Wealth of Nations, there's been a huge emphasis on openness to change, whether it's from competition within an economy or competition across economies. And I think I've heard you say that the invisible hand seems invisible because it's actually not there. I don't quite agree with that. Maybe you'll clarify. I have Smith and Hayek on my bedstand. But what do you mean by that? And how important is competition at home and abroad?
So what I meant by that, it was a critique of what is sometimes called the first welfare theorem in economics, Adam Smith's invisible hand theorem, which says the pursuit of self-interest leads as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. And the question is, what were the conditions under which that was true? And obviously you needed competition. You needed there not to be externalities like climate change. But one of the intellectual contributions that I made with our colleague here, Bruce Greenwald, was to show that whenever there was imperfections of information, which is always the case, or whenever there were incomplete risk markets, which is always the case, then the market is not efficient, it's not Pareto efficient. And there were always government interventions that could make everybody better off. And so what Bruce and I succeeded in doing was to show that in any relevant sense, Adam Smith was wrong. Now, Adam Smith was right because he understood that he didn't believe in the invisible hand theorem. So he agreed with us, but disagreed with many people who claimed to be Smithian. So that's what I meant when I said the invisible hand was invisible because it just wasn't there. It wasn't, in general, the case that markets necessarily lead to efficient outcomes.
Well, let me push you on that a little bit. So let's say that's true. Does it necessarily follow that the correct government intervention is chosen? You've handicapped one side of the argument, but then come in and said, well, I can choose a first best intervention that someone as great as Joe Stiglitz could choose as opposed to an actual political process. How much confidence should we have that we go from theory to practice so easily?
Yeah, so, yeah, that's a result that says just that decentralized markets on their own don't have this miracle property that the advocates claim. We should not think of markets as, in general, efficient. And then we start thinking a little bit about what I might call I'll call successes, the terrible things that we faced in recent years. The financial crisis of 2008 with predatory lending, credit card abuses. We think of the OxyContin, the opioid crisis in the United States. We think of the tobacco behavior of the tobacco companies. We think of Dieselgate. We think of the food companies. And I could go on. The basic thing is, if you look across a lot of the corporate sector, there's not what you might be call ideal behavior. Not all of these represent behavior that is welfare maximizing. So the answer to the question, do I believe that we can intervene in ways that increase societal well-being relative to the norm I've just described? The answer is unambiguously yes. We can have financial regulation. It worked for a long time until we decided we didn't need as much. We didn't need financial regulation. I think we can, and we are moving to, Europe functions without the opioid crisis because they regulate the drug industry somewhat differently. So I think we can have regulations to stop some of these worst problems, including, the worst manifestations. I think we can, we know that markets on their own won't invest enough in basic research. We know the reason for that. It's a public good, and we can have a reasoned discussion about how much of that we want, but we need government intervention for providing that kind of, and in the midst of the crisis, the pandemic, we said, let's have an acceleration of the production of mRNA vaccines based on basic research the government had funded in developing the mRNA platforms. So to me, that's government intervention, that's government action. Now, as you say, where we draw the boundaries, where, we need regulations, I think. We need public investments in things like basic research. Where we draw the line is part of the democratic debate. Sure. And, not every intervention is well designed. And we have to assess when it's successful, when it's failure, correct those failures, just like businesses have to correct their failures. But I think if we have a robust political debate over these issues, I think we can get the bounds of government intervention better, and that will improve what we've seen we've gotten in a too under-regulated economy.
To draw together what you and I've been talking about, and that's a code word to say after a couple questions, I'm going to be looking up to you all for questions. I want to ask you about business, I want to ask you about government, I want to ask you about economists. So in business, you had already picked on Milton Friedman. So I'm gonna come to his defense. So Friedman's famous piece, which was written in 1970, I'm gonna outline some assumptions, and you tell me where I've gone wrong. So let's assume that all markets are competitive. Market for goods, market for capital, market for labor. Let's assume that government does its job, meaning it provides public goods optimally, it prices externalities. Let's assume that to maximize profits, which was in the title of the New York Times piece, means maximize the long-term value of the firm. Wouldn't it then follow that the best thing a manager could do is to maximize the long-term value of the firm? Where did I go wrong?
Well, you went wrong by those assumptions, not describing any
okay.
world that we live in.
Okay.
So, if that were the world, Milton Friedman is still not right. So I'll come to that in a second.
Okay.
But without even going there, the fact is that we don't live in the world.
True.
And therefore, what he said has no relevance, or I'm going to say, has limited relevance to the world we actually live in. And that was the example I gave. The government hasn't yet come around to making environmental regulation. Should you go ahead and pollute the environment? If you don't, this is a big issue that's going around. Government in 1900 didn't have laws about child labor. And the leading business organizations fought having laws about child labor. And the question was, should a decent society go ahead and have child labor? And if you're a manager, should you go ahead and take advantage of poor families and say, basically, I'll hire your child for $1 an hour, or at that time 10 cents an hour, 5 cents an hour, because I know you're starving and you'll do it. Okay, and I think it's a responsibility of the business community to advocate for child labor laws as a decent civilization, and if you're an individual manager, to think about not to hire them, even though it's a quandary, because the is going to suffer because they don't have the income. But it's just, in some sense, fundamentally wrong to exploit the family. So that's where I think Milton Friedman was wrong, given that we don't have those the child labor laws. We don't have environmental laws. But let me say one more thing. Sandy Grossman and I published 2 papers that around the time that Milton Friedman did. We published it in the QJE and the Journal of Finance. It didn't get as much attention as Milton Friedman's New York Times article, but we proved that the only conditions under which Milton Friedman was right, that shareholder maximization would work, were all the conditions that you assumed, plus all the conditions that Bruce and I eventually said you needed. You had to have a full set of risk markets, perfect information. So what we did is to say, what were the conditions under which Milton Friedman was right, that shareholder value maximization would work? And those were much more stringent than the conditions that you listed.
So what more do you think business leaders ought to do today? We have child labor laws. So what should business leaders today be doing? What's the modern version of child labor laws?
Well, I think it goes back to what I said is, what is, let me give you some examples that are, I think, easy, and then from there you go more difficult. I think some employers, for instance, have been engaged in what is called just-in-time scheduling. that was the source of the threat of the strike on the railroads, where they wouldn't be given the notice of when they would work. They had to be on call 52 weeks a year. And they said, we can't live our life that way. And I thought the union was right. And what management was doing was saving just a little bit of money on their side, but causing an enormous stress on their worker side. If there were equal bargaining power, that never would have happened. You know, if you look at how much the company saved versus the psychological cost, the life cost to the worker, that kind of arrangement, that's an example of what from today, you know, split scheduling in retail is a practice where you make the worker go work from 10 to 12, then say, come and work from 5 to 10 in the evening. But I won't pay you between, and they can't go home, and they have a 15-hour effective work day, but they're paid for 7 hours. That to me is another kind of exploitation.
Well, let me do a lightning round on government and economists. So your phone is ringing. It's a presidential candidate for 2024. It's not Vivek Ramaswamy, it's somebody else. and he or she asks you, what one or two things could they go out and campaign on for a more inclusive capitalism?
Well, I think part of the argument of what would make for a more inclusive capitalism is a more progressive tax system.
Ooh, we can't go there.
I knew you'd say that,
Yeah.
but that's I
He knows
think,
I've spent my life pulling it down the other way.
I think all the evidence is that we could, one way of looking at it is, would Jeff Bezos worked just as hard if he had to pay 80% tax rate on his profits from 10 billion on? And the answer is yes, he would. I mean, it was a windfall gain. And I would say right now, the oil companies have made huge windfall profits from the increase in oil. It wasn't because anything that they did that led to the increase in oil prices. They're making huge take-home pay as a result of that. It doesn't make any sense. So the companies and the CEOs that are making profits related to that ought to be paying higher taxes. In a period where there's a lot of stress on our society. So that's one thing it's not vilifying them. It's just saying, you make windfall profits, just share some of that.
Sounds nicer than malefactors of great wealth, but same idea.
It's not. Yeah. It's not. No. It says, it's not taking all of it away. You're making some, but these are windfall profits. So to me, that's part of it. And the reason why I stress that is, in part, you have to have resources if you're going to do some of the other parts of inclusive capitalism, which is education. We talked about in the beginning of moving people from the losing sectors to the winning sectors. One of the things about that we know that a good education system succeeds in doing is making people better able to adapt to changing marketplace, more flexible. And so if we improve the quality of our education system, it is succeeding in creating a more inclusive capitalism. I would put also more thought. This is not something I think he could campaign on, but I think it's something he should do, is trying to steer technical change. We've been steering, the market has been steering a lot of the technical change in ways to create, to replace labor, unskilled labor. We already have a lot of unemployment of unskilled labor. That's not the problem. We are spending a lot of our innovation in creating a better advertising engine in Silicon Valley. I think advertising is great as long as it's not giving misinformation, which a lot of it does, or propaganda. But that shouldn't be the basis of societal innovation. We need to save the planet. There are lots of things that we could do that would improve our standards of living. And I don't think a better advertising agent is a key ingredient to that.
Lightning round on economists. So we've talked about what government can do. We talked about what business leaders can do. What is it that economists should be doing to advance a conversation on the future of capitalism?
Well, I think the first, doctors, when they graduate, get their MD, they have to sign a Hippocratic oath, do no harm. So for me, the first order of business of the economics profession is to stop doing harm. I think they've done a lot of harm. And the harm that they've done is to propagate the idea that markets solve all problems. You haven't been doing that, but there is a core idea.
Secretly suspects I have. That's why you said
it. There is a core idea that unregulated markets alone are, just let markets rip. And I think one of the things that we need to explain is that's not true. And that, I think Friedman and Hayek have done enormous harm in propagating we've talked about the idea of shareholder capitalism and why it's not the right idea. I think they've done enormous harm in linking the word freedom and capitalism. One of Milton Friedman's book was called
Capitalism and Freedom.
And as if you want freedom, you have to have capitalism. And by capitalism, he meant unregulated capitalism. So he wrote a book subsequently called Free to Choose that I've relabeled Free to Exploit. And so that set of ideas that you should have that kind of freedom to exploit, I think is very dangerous. So to me, if economists could spend more time explaining why we need a balance in our society, that it's a large organization, if you want to think it's going to need to be decentralized. How do you think about decentralization? We're going to need a rich ecology of institutions. They're going to be different NGOs, not-for-profits like Columbia University, cooperatives, a whole set of institutions. And how do we create a set of institutions that work together to create a kind of inclusive prosperity?
Okay. We've gone from Hayek to Hippocrates. So now we're going to let it rip with you all. One thing I'd say just before opening up, to pick up on something Joe said, if anyone's interested in the kinds of remarks Joe just made, there is a wonderful sociologist, Karl Polanyi, whose work sheds light on some of this, the point that an economy is embedded in society. And that's something many economists and sometimes politicians forget. We're going to open it up. Only two requests of you. One, that it's an actual question, and two, that you wait for the microphone. So if you raise your hand, sir, right there. Wrong, sir, but we'll get to you too. Go for it. No, go for it.
Okay, thanks so much for being here. The question is about the trend of the rise of inequality across time. And is something to fight against it or not, in the sense that when you look at history, except the period after World War II until the 80s, every time you have a peaceful society, inequality rises across time. And that is true even in Sweden. The Gini coefficient has been risen steadily since the 80s, and it's true beyond capitalism. So given that historical reality, what do you think should be the reaction of policymakers?
So I think implicit, I think in the question is inequality of the level that we have and the ever-increasing level of inequality inevitable? And this has been part of the discussion that Piketty and I've been somewhat disagreeing with Piketty on this issue, that the period after World War II until about 1980 was unusual in that that was a period in which inequality came down. But my view is, we've only had a relatively short period of capitalism, 250 years. So you shouldn't read too much into those experiences. What I worry about right now is some of the new developments like an AI and robotization may actually exacerbate inequality unless we do something about it. And that's a little bit where I was going when I said we ought to be steering innovation. The innovation direction that right now is really heading us to, I'm worried about much more inequality. And part of the agenda is to try to stop this, or at least hold it back. And basically, much of the inequality that we have today is a matter of what I call choice. It's a matter of public consequence of public policy. We haven't effectively enforced antitrust laws. We've had an increase in market power. We allowed our education system in the United States, public education system, to deteriorate. We could have done something about that. That there are a whole set of rules like shareholder value maximization that could certainly ameliorate, if not reverse, these trends. So my views very strongly is what we are seeing is the result of decisions that we made to a very large extent, and we can reverse those decisions.
I'll come to this side in a minute, but there was a question right up there. Yep.
Thank you so much for being here. My question goes back to the comments you had on trade and technology innovation, on how they can harm the unskilled labor, and trying to make it tangible to a discussion that we're going to have maybe in the next 2 to 5 years about autonomous vehicles and how the technology can displace these unskilled workers. And my question is, given the challenge of the mobility in workers and the harmful effects it can have to these workers, what is the solution here? Is it to stall the innovation? Is it to try to reskill them somehow?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is where, I think the answer is really reskilling, but it needs a much strong, not only reskilling, but creating, supporting new industries. So it's industrial policy. And by industrial policy, I include redirecting innovation in ways that help create new jobs to replace the old jobs with similar skills, maybe different jobs. Maybe I should comment, I'm a little bit optimistic for the next 30 years if we get our policies right, because a lot of the things that we need to do for climate change are things that do not require highly skilled labor. We need to install solar panels. We need retrofitting, all of our transportation, our real estate. There's a real reconstruction of the economy that we will need over the next 30 years. And if we do it right, we get the right policies in place, the next 30 years, I think, could be a period where we have a high demand for labor, including unskilled labor. After that, I am more worried, but I won't be here. So it's not my problem, but you all will be. And the reason why I say that is that you take an electric car, it is more expensive to build an electric car, but they last a lot longer, the engines, and they don't need the same kind of maintenance. So the upfront cost of electrification of our transportation system is going to be very large. And it's going to go on for 20 years, 30 years. But once we have it, we're going to need actually less labor. And that speaks to a very general point that I think is not well understood. Sometimes it's naively said that every innovation has actually created more jobs than it replaced. And in the past, there's been a lot of innovation of that kind. They say, well, when we invented the car, we didn't need buggies anymore, but we created a lot of jobs in car repair and lots of other things. But at an abstract level, there are labor-saving innovations. There are innovations that actually reduce the demand for labor. And it was not inevitable that the innovations we had in the past did not save labor. They augmented labor, they increased the power of labor, they increased the demand for labor. But we may actually be having innovations now that actually do replace labor, so much so that the demand for labor could go down unless we manage our whole economic system, and that would increase inequality.
Over here, yeah, in the back.
Hi, thank you. So my question is around sort of the return of great power competition today, and sort of how that you think that impacts the future of capitalism. You talked a little bit about the challenges with innovation and inequality, and the fact that these great powers are now thinking about competing in innovation in potential sort of non-market driven ways. How do you think about that?
Quite hear the question.
It's about great power competition. I'm going to paraphrase. When you're competing against powerful non-market economies, if I'm not capturing the gist, you'll tell me, does that change capitalism? Is that fair?
Yeah. I mean, that's a very good question because, at the end of the Cold War, Francis Fukuyama wrote a very influential book called The End of History. And he, in a very Pollyannish way, thought we were all going to be converging into liberal democracies and free market economies. And it's very clear we are not converging into liberal democracies, and we are not.
Even within liberal democracies.
Yeah, even within and we are not converging into free market economy. So the global economic system, we wrote a set of rules in the WTO that was fundamentally predicated that it would be competition among free market economies. There was one provision about what they were called countervailing duties between for non-free market economies. They were very abstruse provisions that were not well written. But anyway, the fact that we are engaged in this competition does have very big implications for rewriting those international rules of the game. Right now, they are affecting American policy in a very strong way. And I'd like to get Glenn's reaction to it. One, in particular, we passed the CHIPS Act. And we've said that China is effectively subsidizing its chips industry. And if we're going to compete, we have to do the same. And I've always been an advocate of industrial policies anyway, even without that. It may change the nature of those industrial policies, but I've always thought that Bruce and I wrote a whole book called Creating a Learning Society, about why when there are large cross-firm or cross-sector externalities, you need government intervention in affecting the structure of innovation. So we've advocated in different ways the government have industrial policies, especially for developing countries. But this issue now is really right on the table for the United States, and we don't have a really fully coherent policy. What was interesting was that the CHIPS Act has a lot of support from both Democrats and Republicans. So, and the competition with China has changed the politics around industrial policy. But, Glenn, you want to?
Well, I want to give them a chance for a lightning round with you. Anytime you use the word industrial policy, my stomach churns a tiny, tiny bit. So anybody got a lightning question, which means super fast question, super fast answer? Sir, right there.
So certain cultures, when it comes to consumerism, sort of believe that more is always less. So do you think there's, apart from policy and regulation, there's also a need to build a narrative that on how do you actually view consumerism in the country, and can you change the cultural narrative around it? Given that there are a lot of negative externalities to, consuming more and more. And while climate change is one of them, loss of biodiversity and stuff like that is still yet to come.
Well,
lightning response.
Okay, lightning. Okay. We can have growth without a growth in material consumption. Material goods are only an increasingly small fraction of GDP. What we're doing here is not material consumption. We use materials, but it's about ideas, culture. So to me, what is going to happen in terms of lightning response is a change in the nature of what we do. Our basic needs now, food, shelter, clothing, are an increasingly small share of our consumption, and it's the rest that will constitute increases in our standards of living.
Thanks for helping us capture lightning in a bottle. One thing Milton Friedman said that's 100% spot on is there's no such thing as a free lunch. We're grateful you spent yours with us talking about the future of capitalism. Join me in thanking Joe. And thank you.